The red dot materialized before Clara could finish pouring the coffee. A minuscule ruby orb danced across the stranger's chest, settling precisely over his heart. "Don't move!" she yelled, her voice piercing the air, thick with the aroma of coffee and the dampness of the midnight rain. Glass responded with a violent retort. A sharp crack ripped through the front of the Silver Lark Café, shards scattering like a swarm of malevolent fireflies. Clara didn't have time to process what was happening. The man's body slumped, his arm instinctively wrapping around her shoulder, and they both vanished behind the overturned wooden table. The acrid scent of gunpowder assaulted her senses. Rain battered the building's frame like a relentless, cold drumline. In the corner, the espresso machine continued its mechanical hiss, a domestic sound rendered grotesque by the surrounding chaos. 5 minutes earlier, there had only been Clara Bennett, 25, a freelance composer running on fumes at a 24/7 cafe in Soho, calculating her debts against the backdrop of a melody that seemed to perpetually elude its ending. The floor tiles were slick and black from the rain. The neon sign outside flickered erratically across the stainless steel counter, providing the only light she could afford. Then, Adrian Morrow walked in, and the atmosphere in the room palpably shifted. He was accompanied by 2 men, no introductions offered, no unnecessary noise made. His charcoal overcoat was still damp from the rain, but its tailored cut whispered of an exorbitant price tag. One guard stationed himself near the door. The other casually drifted to the end of the counter. Their eyes methodically swept the corners of the cafe like unsheathed blades, constantly alert. Neither of them even glanced at a menu. Clara was a practiced observer. Music had trained her to discern rhythm and recognize patterns. The cadence of heartbeats, the drumming of rainfall, the cycling of traffic lights, the subtle breathing of a night nearing its end. In this man, all the beats resonated with a singular, unwavering language. Control. A platinum wristwatch, thin as a whisper, served as a credential, close to a sonata. A discreet gold signet ring adorned his little finger, a display of power without ostentation. A faint scar rested just above his left eyebrow, an almost invisible accent mark. And then there were his eyes, cold and deep as smoke. "Black, no sugar," he said when she asked for his order. 2 words, and the coffee grinder seemed to momentarily pause, as if in deference. She turned, placing the pot on the burner, still mentally cataloging the 4ths and 5ths of her fragmented theme, when the anomaly flashed across her field of vision. A red dot, no larger than the lamp on a metronome gone haywire, skipped from the metal edge of the counter to the stranger's lapel, settling dead center on his chest. In music, miss a beat and you're off key. Here, miss a beat and you're dead. "Don't move." The words erupted from her mouth before she even had time to think. She saw him flinch almost imperceptibly. His gaze flicked across her face, registering not fear, but a lightning-fast calculation. The first shot was like a sudden lightning strike. The window shattered. Wind and rain surged through the broken frame, snapping the worn curtain. A cup tumbled from the counter and shattered like a cheap firework. A gunshot tore through the air. Glass exploded, and the rain howled into the cafe. Something metallic whizzed past her ear and embedded itself in the wall. Shards stung her arms, cold and wet. The first shot hadn't even faded before the second ripped through the air, sharp, violent, tearing the night in two. Glass shattered, exploding outward in a rain of fragments that scattered light like wild sparks. The smell of gunpowder permeated the cafe, metallic, acrid, and choking. Adrian reacted instinctively. He kicked the edge of the table, flipping it upward, and threw his weight forward, pulling her down with him. Everything happened in the span of a heartbeat. A rush of air, a deafening crash, then darkness, and the sound of 2 heartbeats pounding in unison. Clara felt his breath on her neck, hot and uneven, laced with a mingling scent of gunpowder and expensive cologne. His arm pinned her shoulders, firm and cold as iron, yet trembling faintly, not with fear, but with the electric aftershock of raw instinct. They were a tangled mess, pressed between the cold floor and the primal pulse of survival. A third bullet struck the espresso machine behind them, showering them with sparks. The lights flickered, then died, leaving behind the acrid stench of burnt metal. Rain hammered the shattered windows, joining the staccato rhythm of gunfire echoing from across the street. Rooftop, 5th floor, right side. One of his men shouted over the chaos. Adrian didn't even lift his head. His palm pressed gently against the back of her neck. "Stay down," he said, his voice low and rough. 2 words, an order but also a shield. And for a fleeting, terrifying second, she trusted it. Gunfire roared in reply. Then silence crashed down like a heavy curtain, complete and absolute. She could hear it now. The syncopated rhythm of their hearts, still beating, still alive. He rose first, breathing heavily, his eyes sharp and bright beneath the flickering of the broken lights. "How did you know?" His tone was quieter now, the steel edge softened with something else. Curiosity, perhaps even disbelief. Clara pushed herself up, brushing shards of glass from her skirt. Her fingers trembled. "I'm a composer," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, her eyes meeting his. "I recognize rhythm in sound, and in light." He studied her for a moment, his gaze unreadable. Rain pattered through the broken window, scattering silver droplets on the floor. Slowly, he nodded, the corner of his mouth twitching into something almost resembling a smile. "Rhythm," he murmured. "And you just saved my life by breaking one." She didn't answer. Her eyes drifted across the wreckage. The shards of glass, the overturned chairs, the river of spilled coffee snaking across the tiles like diluted blood, the cloying scent of smoke and rain churning in her stomach. Just minutes ago, she'd been a tired barista struggling to make rent. Now, she was sitting in the middle of a war zone beside a man the tabloids called untouchable. Sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer. Blue and red lights strobed across the wrecked cafe. Adrian glanced towards the window. "Police," he muttered. Clara scrambled to her feet. "Good. They can help." "No." He cut her off, his tone quiet but unyielding. The wind caught his coat, spreading it behind him like a dark wing. "If they see you, he'll know, and he'll come again before they finish their paperwork." She backed away, fear gripping her. "I don't even know what this is. I don't know who you are." His hand closed around her wrist, firm but not cruel. "You do now." Her breath caught. His eyes locked on hers, and for the first time, she realized this wasn't a man running from chaos. He was the kind of man chaos followed. Outside, the rain and sirens wove together into a violent symphony of blue and red. Adrian raised his phone, speaking rapidly in French. Clara caught fragments. Clear, exit, back route. When he hung up, his decision was already made. "You're coming with me now." She shook her head, desperate. "No, I'll stay. I'll tell them everything. I've done nothing wrong." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. "If you stay," he said softly, "you'll be dead before they ask the first question." The words landed with the weight of certainty. Not a threat, but a simple truth. Before she could argue, he took her hand again, leading her through the wreckage. Wind lashed through the doorway, rain slicing across her face, cold as blades. She stumbled but didn't pull away. There was something about him, about the way he moved, that felt terrifyingly controlled, like a man orchestrating his own escape. A black car idled by the curb. One of his men opened the door without a word. Adrian guided her inside, then followed. The door thudded shut, cutting off the rain, the sirens, the wreckage of her old life. Clara sat frozen, her heart pounding against her ribs. Beside her, Adrian stared out the window, the city lights sliding across his face in red and blue waves. Each droplet of rain streaking down the glass intersected in patterns that, to her composer's eye, resembled a score written in chaos. "You're safe now," he said quietly, without looking at her. Clara turned, her voice trembling. "No, I don't think I am." Outside, the rain kept falling, cold and relentless, and in its reflection, the city burned in 1,000 shards of fire and glass. The car sliced through the rain, its tires whispering against the wet asphalt. Clara stared out the window, watching the police lights fade into a distant blur of red and blue, dissolving into the mist like a dying dream. Her hands were still trembling, her heart still hammered in her chest, a frantic, irregular rhythm. Beside her, Adrian sat in silence, his reflection merging with his shadow in the window, one clear, one ghostly. Neither spoke. The only sound was the steady hum of the engine and the syncopated whisper of the windshield wipers. Clara watched him from the corner of her eye. His hands were folded motionless, yet they radiated a palpable sense of contained power. She couldn't fathom how a man who had just escaped death could sit there so composed, as if danger itself were an old acquaintance. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice rough and fragile. "Somewhere safe," he said without turning. "You'll stay there until I'm certain no one can find you. And if I don't want to stay?" His eyes flicked towards her, sharp as a blade. "Do you want to live?" She fell silent. The car turned off the main road and onto a quiet street lined with ancient oaks. Ahead, a white stone mansion loomed out of the fog, enormous and still. The iron gates creaked open on their own, soundless but heavy. 2 cameras rotated atop the pillars, their red lights blinking like the eyes of sleepless sentinels. "Welcome to the fortress," Adrian murmured, a hint of irony in his tone. Cold air rushed in as he opened the door. Clara stepped out, her shoes sinking into a shallow puddle. The mansion rose before her, a monolith of marble and shadow, its tall windows glowing amber against the storm. Somewhere, a wind chime rang softly, a lonely metallic whisper lost in the rain. A woman appeared in the doorway, small and neat, her silvered hair pulled back into a tight knot. Her eyes widened when she saw Clara, then quickly hardened into weary composure. "Mr. Morrow," she said quietly, "you're home. And this young woman, someone who needs protection," Adrian said. He strode past her, his wet shoes leaving faint trails on the marble floor. "Margaret, prepare a room for her. 3rd floor, no one enters." "Yes, sir," she replied, her tone caught between obedience and concern. He disappeared through the tall double doors at the end of the hall, and the house seemed to inhale and hold its breath. Margaret turned to Clara with a thin, tired smile. "Come, dear, you're soaked through. Let's get you warm." Clara followed her down the long corridor, her steps echoing against the marble, hollow and strange. Everything in this house felt curated, arranged with a precision that allowed no room for accident. The oil paintings of violent seas, the bronze statues frozen mid-motion, the chandeliers that glowed just enough to keep shadows from ever fully disappearing. They passed a grand piano, its black lid half open, the keys gleaming like the teeth of some elegant predator. Clara paused, drawn by instinct, and let her fingertip brush a single key. A single note rang out, clear, resonant, haunting. "You play?" Margaret asked, a flicker of warmth in her tone. "I compose," Clara said softly. "Then perhaps you won't be lonely here," the woman replied. But her eyes darted away, betraying that she knew loneliness was exactly what this place thrived on. The room Margaret led her to was at the end of a long corridor on the 3rd floor. The door was heavy oak, its hinges silent. Inside, it was perfection. White sheets, silver drapes, a fireplace whispering with flames. A wardrobe stood ready, stocked with clothes that somehow seemed to be her size. Clara frowned. "How long am I supposed to stay here?" "Until Mr. Morrow says it's safe," Margaret said after a pause. "And if I want to leave?" The woman's face softened with pity. "You can't, dear. Not yet." Margaret left, and the door clicked shut behind her. The sound of the lock turning was small, almost gentle, but to Clara, it was deafening. She crossed the room and tried the handle. It didn't budge. She tried again with the same result. A chill raced down her spine. She turned, scanning the room. Too beautiful, too quiet, too controlled. There was no draft, no creak, no sound beyond the fire's soft crackle. It was the silence of a cage disguised as comfort. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly together. Escape from where? To where? Beyond these walls was only the storm. And beyond the storm, a world she no longer recognized. The truth hit her with a hollow weight. She wasn't a guest here. She was a prisoner. From below, a door opened. Adrienne's voice carried faintly upward, low, deliberate, and steady. She couldn't make out the words, only the rhythm. It was the kind of voice that could command armies or conduct orchestras. Clara rose and went to the window. Outside, the gardens stretched dark and gleaming, the trees dripping with rain like silver threads. Beyond them, the lights of London shimmered faintly, distant as a mirage. She pressed her forehead against the glass. The chill seeped into her skin, grounding her. In her reflection on the window pane, she saw a stranger. A drenched, frightened woman with wide eyes and clenched fists, trapped between worlds of light and shadow. And somewhere below, the man who'd brought her here, Adrienne Morrow, was already moving the next piece on a chessboard she couldn't even see. The first morning in Adrienne's mansion arrived like a slow-motion dream. When Clara woke, pale London light filtered through the silver curtains, tracing faint lines across the marble floor. She didn't know how long she had slept, only that the echoes of rain and the metallic slam of the gate still haunted her dreams. The scent of wood smoke and lavender lingered in the air, and the silence was so complete she could hear the ticking of a clock, steady and deliberate, like the heartbeat of the house itself. On the table lay a silver tray, steaming black tea, toasted bread, and a folded note written in strong, deliberate handwriting. Breakfast. Margaret will show you around. M. The ink was slightly smudged, as if written quickly, but the lines were bold and certain. Something in that writing made her chest tighten, not with fear, but with something stranger, like curiosity disguised as caution. Margaret appeared just as Clara was staring at the note, holding a gray wool cardigan. "It's damp outside," she said softly. "You should see the house. It helps to know where you are." By daylight, the mansion was even more overwhelming. The hallways stretched endlessly, the ceilings heavy with chandeliers that shimmered like frozen rain. Every wall was adorned with a painting. Stormy seas, winter forests, portraits of women with eyes too sad to forget. Clara's footsteps echoed in rhythm, a sound that felt both alive and hollow. Margaret led her into the grand salon. In the center stood a black grand piano, its polished surface catching the early light, each key gleaming like an ivory mirror. Beyond the wide windows lay a misted garden, roses pale and glistening beneath a veil of fog. "Mr. Morrow loves music," Margaret said, noticing Clara's gaze. "His mother was a violinist. She passed when he was very young." Clara nodded, an unfamiliar ache stirring in her chest. A man born into violence but raised by melody. No wonder he felt like a contradiction she couldn't resolve. The morning drifted by slowly. She ate lunch alone by the window, watching the rain bead and slide down the glass. No phone, no internet, only shelves lined with old books and silence. When she asked Margaret if she could leave, the woman's answer was the same. "Not yet, dear." By afternoon, the sky had turned the color of ash. Clara found herself wandering again, her steps carrying her back to the piano. She sat down, her fingers hovering uncertainly above the keys, then pressed one. A single note filled the room, soft, trembling, but alive. She began to play an old piece she'd written for someone she no longer spoke to. The melody was fragile, hesitant, but it spread through the silence like breath. For a few moments, she wasn't afraid anymore. She was simply herself again, a composer trying to make sense of the world through sound. When the final note faded, a quiet clap startled her. She turned sharply. Adrian stood in the doorway, rain still glistening in his hair, his sleeves rolled up, his eyes half-shadowed and unreadable. "Not bad," he said, his voice low, rough around the edges. "Debussy would approve." "How long were you standing there?" "Long enough to know you don't belong in a place like that cafe," he said. "I didn't choose it," she replied, her tone sharp despite the tremor in her chest. I just needed to survive. He stepped closer, his gaze holding hers. And you still are, just somewhere else, as a prisoner. A pause. Then softly, as someone under protection. The words didn't comfort her. They only deepened the strange, charged air between them. He stopped beside the piano and placed a small wooden box on its lid. This is for you. Inside lay a set of graphite pencils, sheets of music paper, and a vintage fountain pen, the kind only a musician would know to buy. To keep your mind occupied, he said. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she touched the paper. She couldn't tell whether this was kindness or another kind of control. A cage gilded in art, but a cage nonetheless. Do you always do this? She asked quietly. Keep people by giving them beautiful things? He smiled faintly, and for a moment it looked almost sad. No, only the ones who have a reason to survive. Their eyes met, and for several long seconds neither moved. The rain filled the silence, tapping against the glass like soft percussion. Then his voice came, low and deliberate. Start writing, Clara. Sometimes music says what words shouldn't. He left, the scent of cedar and rain trailing behind him. Clara remained still, watching his silhouette vanish into the dim light of the hall. Turning back to the piano, she opened a blank page. The pen hovered over the staves. Instead of notes, she wrote one line across the top. A golden cage is still a cage, even if it sings. Outside, the wind swept through the garden, carrying the scent of wet roses. Her melody rose to meet it, tender, uncertain, and trembling, like the heart of someone who had just begun to love and to fear in the same breath. That night, after Adrian left the music room, the sound of the closing door lingered like a fading chord. Clara remained by the piano, staring at the half-written sheet of music. The final line still read, "A golden cage is still a cage, even if it sings." She read it again and again, but no more words would come. The fire had burned low, leaving only embers that pulsed faintly like a tired heart. Outside, the rain hadn't stopped. By the time she returned to her room, it was close to midnight. She expected exhaustion to claim her, but sleep stayed away. Instead came a silence so dense it seemed alive. The wind hissed against the windows. The clock ticked steadily, and then, through the quiet, came a sound. First, she thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. It was too deliberate, too fragile. Notes. Piano notes. Clara's pulse quickened. She slipped into the corridor barefoot, following the sound down the dim hallway. It came from the study, a room she had never entered. The melody floated through the house, raw and haunting, as if the walls themselves were remembering something. From the landing, she saw him. Adrian sat at the grand piano, his back straight, his head slightly bowed. The firelight washed over him, carving gold into his dark hair, his hands, his profile. The rest of the room was drowned in shadow. For a long moment, Clara simply watched. This wasn't the man who commanded silence with a glance. This was someone else entirely, someone stripped bare, playing not for an audience, but for ghosts. The melody had no form, no rhythm, only emotion. It rose and broke like a tide. Each note carried sorrow, defiance, and something deeper, loneliness so profound it vibrated in her bones. The floor creaked under her step. Adrian paused but didn't turn. His voice came quietly, rough from fatigue. How long were you planning to listen, Clara? I wasn't spying, she stammered. I heard the music. I thought that someone might need to be heard. She nodded, stepping into the light. He turned his head slightly, and the fire's glow caught his eyes. They were tired, yes, but human. Sit, he said. Music deserves an audience. She sat across from him near the fire. The study was different from the rest of the mansion. Less polished, more alive. Papers covered the desk, maps, handwritten notes, scattered sheet music. In one corner stood a silver-framed photograph, a stern man with the same sharp eyes as Adrian. Your father? She asked softly. Adrian nodded. Lucian Morrow, a legend or a monster, depending on who you ask. He paused. When he died, I tried to rebuild what he left behind, to make it clean. But men who live in shadows don't like the light. They called me a traitor. And the shooting at the cafe, he exhaled slowly. Them, my own people, someone I trusted. I don't know who yet. They want me gone, to replace me with someone who will do the old, dirty work again. Aren't you afraid? He gave a dry laugh. Always, but fear changes nothing. You learn to live with it like you live with a scar. The firelight deepened the lines of his face, turning him into a portrait of quiet ruin. Clara realized then that behind his control was a man trapped by inheritance, as much a prisoner of his world as she was of his house. You're not just trying to do what's right, she whispered. You're trying to make amends. His gaze flickered, breaking for just a second before he looked away. Maybe, but for whom? For my father? For myself? I don't know anymore. They fell silent. The fire crackled softly, its glow flickering across their faces. Two figures caught between shadow and light. My father used to say, Adrian murmured, that the strongest man is the one who hides his wounds. But I think he was wrong. Why? She asked. Because sometimes, he said, looking straight into her eyes. The wound is the only thing that reminds you you're still human. Her breath caught. In that moment, she saw not power or menace in him, but pain and something dangerously close to vulnerability. Go to bed, Clara, he said quietly. Tonight, I don't need an audience. She rose, hesitating at the door. He was already turned away, his figure lit by the fire, a man bound to ghosts he could never outrun. In the hallway mirror, she caught her reflection, and behind it, faintly, his two shapes, one walking away, one still burning in the background like an echo. That night, sleep never came. Only the music did, soft, broken, endless. Twining through her heart like a secret she wasn't ready to understand. Somewhere deep down, Clara knew she was no longer just someone under his protection. She was already part of his melody, a song beautiful, enough to destroy them both. Time seemed to warp inside the Kensington mansion. Days and nights lost their distinction, becoming a continuous blur punctuated only by the sound of piano keys and the relentless rhythm of rain. Clara adapted to the peculiar stillness, taking her breakfasts in complete silence. She spent hours composing by the window, overlooking the misty garden, and experienced fleeting moments when Adrienne's shadow would pass through the hallways, his gaze brushing hers like static electricity. One morning, as she experimented with a new melody in the drawing room, he materialized. No sound, no warning, just his reflection staring back at her from the polished surface of the piano. You've altered the rhythm here, he observed, leaning casually against a marble column, his voice low and even. It disrupts the balance. She glanced up, her brow furrowed. I prefer it this way. Music isn't meant to be perfect. His lips curved in a subtle smile. Perhaps not, but too much dissonance and people lose their way. She smiled back, softly, yet with defiance. Only those who don't listen with their hearts. He remained silent, but something in his expression shifted. For the first time, she witnessed him smile. A genuine smile, brief and totally unexpected. After that day, he would often come to listen when she played. Sometimes he would simply sit in silence, absorbing the music. At other times, he would correct her like a stern teacher, meticulously pointing out each missed beat or uneven phrase. She'd roll her eyes playfully, he'd smirk in response, and the air between them would vibrate with a quiet tension, a feeling neither of them dared to acknowledge openly. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the windows, she was composing when he spoke, a glass of wine in his hand. Why do you always compose such sad pieces? Because happiness doesn't need to be written down, she murmured. Sadness does, otherwise it consumes you. He studied her intently, his eyes dark and unreadable. Maybe that's why I enjoy hearing you play. Because I'm sad. Because you're honest. His words silenced her. Their connection deepened gradually, fragile as spun glass. yet impossible to ignore. He appeared more frequently at meals in the garden, leaning in the doorway just to inquire, "Did you write anything today?" And despite her attempts to maintain her distance, her heart betrayed her every time she heard his footsteps approaching in the hall. But not everyone was happy about the change. One afternoon in the library, Elias, the ever-watchful assistant, approached her. His voice was smooth, but his eyes were cold. "Miss Bennet," he began, "do you know why Mr. Morrow saved you?" She turned, suddenly wary. "I didn't exactly have the opportunity to ask." "He doesn't save people," Elias stated evenly. "He keeps them because they owe him something, because he hates loose ends." "Are you warning me?" she asked, her tone hardening. "Call it advice," Elias replied. "He can be generous, but every act of kindness he bestows comes with a price. Don't forget that before you start thinking you actually matter to him." Then he turned and walked away, leaving a faint scent of tobacco and a pervasive sense of unease lingering in the air. Clara remained standing, his words echoing in her mind. Every kindness has a price. That evening, when Adrian joined her in the drawing room, she avoided making eye contact with him. He noticed immediately that something was amiss. "Is everything all right?" "Yes," she lied. "I'm just tired." He didn't press the issue, but as he reached the doorway, he paused. "Clara," he said quietly, "in my world, if I wanted to keep you, I wouldn't disguise it behind kindness." His words should have reassured her, but instead, her heart raced. When he finally left the room, she turned back to the piano. Her fingers instinctively found the keys, replaying the same melody he had once corrected. This time, the imperfect rhythm felt right, alive. Beneath the surface of the notes, something else was stirring. A feeling as dangerous as it was delicate, stretching between them like a wire pulled too tight. Elias was right. Adrienne's gentleness had a cost. But as much as she feared it, she couldn't help craving it. The warmth, the focused attention, the rare smile meant for her alone. Perhaps, she thought, as the last note faded into the silence, she had already ventured too close to the flame, and soon she would discover whether it would warm her or burn everything she knew to the ground. Since Elias's warning, Clara had begun to perceive Adrian in a different light. He was the same man, the same composed demeanor, but every smile, every furtive glance, now carried a question she couldn't ignore. How much of him was genuine and how much was a calculated exercise in control? Yet, caught between doubt and affection, her heart, always foolish, stubbornly chose to believe in him. That night, the rain returned. Adrian was with her in the drawing room, listening to the soft melody she had just composed. He seemed distant, his gaze fixed on something beyond the music. When his phone buzzed, he answered it immediately. "I'm listening. Send me the full report. Confirm before you move." His voice hardened, his eyes narrowing as he processed whatever information he was receiving. When he hung up, the warmth that had filled the room vanished completely. "What happened?" she asked. He hesitated for a moment. "A man I trusted betrayed me. Nicholas Vance, head of the Paris division. I need to confront him now." "It's pouring outside," she pointed out. "All the more reason," he replied. "They strike when I'm complacent. I can't afford to wait." He quickly buttoned his coat, his movements sharp and precise. "Stay inside, Clara. Don't open the door for anyone. Don't answer anyone. Whatever you hear, remain still." The way he said it sent a shiver of fear down her spine. She nodded silently. He paused at the door, looking back at her one last time, his voice softer than it had any right to be. "I'll be back before dawn." Then he was gone, swallowed by the sound of thunder. The house felt emptier than ever before. She waited by the piano, listening to the relentless rain, watching the clock crawl toward morning. 1 hour, 3, almost 5. Then she heard the sound of the gates opening, tires crunching on the wet gravel. Adrian emerged from the car, soaked to the bone, disheveled, his clothes streaked with blood and mud. His eyes were metallic, cold, and furious. "Adrian," she whispered. hurrying toward him. What happened? He didn't answer. He threw his gloves onto the table, the blood smearing across the marble surface. Vance was innocent. Her breath caught in her throat. What? Innocent? He repeated, his voice low and raw with emotion. It was a setup. He turned abruptly, slamming his hand on the table, shattering a glass. Someone wanted me to believe he was the traitor. I reacted too quickly, and now he's dead. I lost the one man who would never betray me. He let out a short, broken laugh. I thought I was in control. Turns out I'm just another pawn on someone else's chessboard. Clara stepped closer to him. His shoulders were shaking slightly. The mask he always wore, the carefully cultivated composure, the aura of power had finally cracked. Adrian, she whispered, gently laying a trembling hand on his arm. You couldn't have known. You did what you thought was right. He looked at her, his eyes dark and glistening, not with tears, but with an exhaustion that seemed to reach his very bones. When you hold power, right and wrong cease to matter. Only the consequences remain. Her throat tightened. Without thinking, she reached up, her palm lightly brushing his cheek. His skin was cold, his jaw tense beneath her touch. He lifted his eyes to meet hers, and in that single heartbeat, the world stood still. The distance between them vanished completely. No more captor and captive, only two people equally broken. He leaned in slightly, close enough that she could feel his breath on her skin, taste the faint scent of rain and smoke clinging to his clothes. Her heart pounded painfully in her chest. For an instant, everything else faded away. Then he stopped. His hand tightened around her shoulder, a gesture that was both gentle and final. Don't, he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. I can't. You don't have to be strong with me, she whispered. That's exactly why I must, he replied, stepping back and reclaiming the distance between them. His tone cooled once more, the man of marble returning. Good night, Clara. He turned and walked out of the room. The door shut behind him with a heavy sound, like the end of something that had almost been. Clara stood there, motionless. Dawn crept slowly into the room, washing everything in a pale light. She realized with an ache she couldn't quite define that she no longer feared him. She loved him, and it hurt, because loving a man like Adrian Morrow meant loving a storm that could never stop destroying itself. Dawn filtered through the fogged windows, casting a dull gray light over the study. Clara hadn't slept. Her head throbbed with exhaustion, haunted by the image of Adrian from the night before, wet, furious, and utterly broken. She heard his footsteps early that morning, heavy yet determined, echoing through the marble halls. She found him in the library, the door ajar. He sat behind his desk, his face pale, his eyes blazing with a grim focus. Elias stood beside him, tension etched into his normally impassive expression. It wasn't Vance, Adrian said quietly, his voice like a honed blade. I received the raw transmission from the source. They wanted me to kill him to conceal the real traitor. He pressed play on a device. A distorted voice filled the air. Let him eliminate Vance. Once blood is spilled, the board will have justification to replace him. Clara felt a chill creep up her spine. Who is that? Adrian looked up, bitterness flickering across his features. Victor Harlow, my father's old advisor. He still wields considerable power within the board. Still believes he can manipulate events as though I were a mere puppet. He stood abruptly. He'll answer for this. Within hours, it was over. The recordings forced Harlow's removal from the board. He vanished before the authorities could apprehend him. Elias handled the fallout, and Adrian returned, not triumphant, but utterly hollow. It's done, he said simply. Harlow is gone for now. She wanted to ask if he felt any relief, but something in his eyes cautioned her against it. Some victories were simply quieter kinds of pain. Later that day, she approached him. I want to return to my apartment, she said. Just once. I need to retrieve something personal. It's not safe, he warned. I'll go with Elias, she insisted. Just for an hour, Adrian, please. He studied her intently, then nodded slowly. Be back before dark. The city was once again drenched in rain. The car came to a stop in front of her old building. The same cracked steps and flickering hallway lights welcoming her back like memories that refused to fade. Elias followed close behind, silent as ever. Her apartment was exactly as she had left it. Small, dusty, lifeless. She crossed the room, opened the old wardrobe and pulled out a wooden box. Inside lay her father's keepsakes. A silver pocket watch, a few faded letters and a photograph. The sight of it stole her breath. Her father, Edward Bennett, stood beside another man, tall, stern, and unmistakably familiar. Lucien Morrow. Her fingers trembled. Turning the photograph over, she read the inscription scrawled on the back. Edward and Lucien. After the Blackstone Project, 1999. She unfolded one of the letters. The paper was brittle. The ink faded, but the words burned with intensity. Maria, my love. I made a terrible mistake trusting Victor Harlow. He claimed Lucien approved the investment. When the funds disappeared, he framed me. Lucien believed him without question. I was given 24 hours to disappear before they made it official. Tell Clara that her father loves her. Tell her I'm sorry. Harlow is the serpent in their garden. I was simply too blind to see it. By the time she reached the end of the letter, tears were blurring the ink. The letter shook in her hands as though it were alive. Every aspect of her life, the loss, the poverty, the shame now had a name, a face, a legacy rooted in the very house where she now resided as a guest. Lucien Morrow had destroyed her father. She stared at the photograph again, Edward smiling trustingly beside the man who would ultimately condemn him. She imagined the moment Lucien had signed the order, never questioning, never caring about the consequences. The room seemed to tilt around her. Miss Bennet, Elias said softly, we should leave. She nodded faintly, slipping the letter into her coat pocket. The rain lashed against her face as they stepped outside, cold and merciless. On the drive back to the mansion, the world became a blur of gray. She barely registered the sound of the engine or Elias's voice. All she could hear was the truth echoing inside her. The man who had ruined her family's life was Lucien Morrow, the father of the man she was beginning to love. A love built on ashes, a wound inherited from their fathers. And Clara knew that whatever fragile bond existed between her and Adrian could never truly withstand the weight of that truth. Rain continued to cling to the city when Clara returned to the Kensington mansion. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down like an oppressive weight. She stepped out of the car, her coat soaked through, clutching the bag that held her father's letter and the photograph. Aaliyah said nothing as he opened the door for her, merely nodding once. The heavy doors closed behind her with a sound of finality. She didn't hesitate. Her footsteps echoed through the marble corridor, her pulse pounding in her ears. The words of her father's letter replayed in her mind again and again. His apology, his fear, his desperate plea. By the time she reached the study, her hands were trembling, not with fear, but with a growing sense of fury. She burst through the door. Adrian turned from the fireplace, surprise flashing in his eyes. Clara. She crossed the room without answering, throwing the photograph and the letter onto his desk. Read it, she demanded, her voice trembling with emotion. He frowned, picked up the pages, and as his eyes scanned the lines, the carefully constructed mask he always wore began to crumble. His breathing slowed. When he finally looked up, there was something hollow in his gaze. Harlow, he whispered. My father, he trusted him. Clara let out a bitter laugh. He didn't just trust him. He allowed Harlow to destroy my father's life. He allowed him to die a fugitive. Adrienne's knuckles whitened as he gripped the letter. Harlow deceived everyone. He poisoned my father's mind, mine too. God. He ran a hand through his hair, his composure shattered. Clara, believe me, I didn't know. I never even heard Edward Bennett's name until today. But your father did. She shot back, her voice breaking. He ruined my family, Adrian. My mother died in shame. I grew up believing my father was a thief. You can't undo that with regret. My father wasn't a monster, he said, though his voice shook. He was blind, and by the time he recognized the truth, it was too late. Harlow had already taken everything from him, from you, from me. Silence filled the space, thick and suffocating as smoke. The fire crackled behind them, casting restless shadows across their faces. I don't know if I can trust you anymore, she whispered. Everything about you feels like a lie. He stepped closer, desperation flickering in his eyes. I'm not your enemy, Clara. Harlow manipulated both of us. He's the one behind the cafe attack, the sniper, the setup. All of it. He wanted me chasing shadows while he dismantled everything from the inside. She stared at him, shocked. Are you certain? He nodded, the anger in his expression giving way to grim realization. Every trail leads back to him. Every betrayal, every death. Even the night you saved me, it was all orchestrated by him. Her chest tightened. She wanted to hate him, but the raw honesty in his voice made it impossible. What will you do now? She asked quietly. Adrienne's gaze hardened. End it once and for all. No more shadows. No more lies. She shook her head, tears glistening in her eyes. You don't understand. Whatever you destroy, it won't bring my father back. Every time I look at you, I see the man who carries his killer's name. He closed the distance between them, gripping her hand tightly. Clara, listen to me. If you leave this house, they'll find you. Harlow's allies know about that letter. You're not safe out there. Maybe not, she whispered. But staying here feels even worse. I'm dying a little more every day, trying to love someone I'm supposed to hate. His hand dropped, her words striking him like a physical blow. Silence descended upon them. The rain pounded against the glass, echoing the rhythm of their hearts, unsteady and broken. If I could choose, he said finally, his voice low and raw with emotion. I'd wish we'd never met because from that moment on, nothing I believed in meant anything anymore. She met his gaze, tears falling freely now. I wish that too, she said, though her heart screamed the opposite. They stood there, two souls bound by pain and legacy, the firelight flickering between them like a dying heartbeat. Outside, the rain continued to fall over London, washing the city clean of everything except the past. And in that endless rain, Clara understood that there was no bridge left between them, only the void that their fathers had carved long before they had ever met. And now they were standing at its edge with nowhere left to go. That night, a thick fog blanketed London, the streetlights bleeding into a hazy golden blur. In the study, Adrian stood before the window, his reflection framed by glass and shadow. He hadn't slept since their confrontation. Clara had barely spoken to him. She had withdrawn into herself, and he, too proud or too afraid, had allowed her to do so. Morning arrived quietly. When Clara descended the stairs, she found him already dressed for travel. Dark suit, polished shoes, and a stillness about him that resembled resignation. A pistol lay on the table beside his passport. I'm leaving, he said simply. Harlow is in France. It ends there. Clara stopped halfway down the staircase. And if it doesn't? He looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, the steel in his gaze softened. Then at least the lies will die with him. Elias entered the room, his face grave. Everything is ready. But what about Miss Bennet? She stays here, Adrian replied firmly. You're responsible for her safety. No one enters. No one leaves. Clara's breath hitched. You're walking into a trap, aren't you? I've lived in one my entire life, he murmured. Then he stepped closer, his voice lowering to something intimate and dangerous. If I don't come back, remember that I never wanted you to be part of this world. But if I had the chance to do it all again, I'd still walk into that cafe. I'd still find you. Before she could speak, he turned and left. The heavy doors closed behind him, taking the warmth of his presence with them. Hours passed. The house was too still, too quiet. Clara tried to compose at the piano, but every note faltered. Elias patrolled the halls like a ghost. Margaret, the housekeeper, moved slower than usual, her eyes darting nervously. By late afternoon, Clara heard a faint crash downstairs. She froze, her heart pounding. Margaret? There was no answer. She walked down the steps, her heart hammering in her chest. The sitting room was empty. A half-finished cup of tea sat cooling on the table. Then she heard a sharp sound, metal scraping against metal. She turned just as a hand clamped around her throat. "Don't scream," a man hissed in her ear. Before she could struggle, a cloth was pressed against her mouth. The sharp chemical sting filled her lungs. The world tilted and then went black. When she regained consciousness, she was bound to a metal chair beneath a flickering light. The air was damp and reeked of rust and river water. Through the cracks in the wall, she could hear the slow lapping of waves. It took her a moment to realize where she was. The abandoned warehouse by the Thames, the same place where Adrian had almost died. The door creaked open. Footsteps echoed on the wet concrete floor. A tall man stepped into the light. Gray hair, sharp suit, a gold ring gleaming on his finger. "Good evening, Miss Bennet," Victor Harlow said smoothly. "You look remarkably like your father. Same eyes, same naivete." Clara's pulse spiked. "You're Harlow." He smiled, inclining his head. "Guilty as charged. You ruined my family, my father?" Yes, tragic story," Harlow interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "But let's not pretend you don't understand why you're here. I don't want you dead, Clara. Not yet. You're bait." "Bait?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Adrian will come," Harlow said calmly. "He always comes, especially when he believes something belongs to him." His lips twisted into a smirk. "You're the perfect chain to pull him back where he belongs." Clara glared at him, forcing her voice to remain steady. "You'll never control him again." "Oh, my dear," Harlow murmured, stepping closer and tapping her chin with his cane. "He's his father's son. Same fatal flaw. He believes he can save people, and that belief will destroy him just like it destroyed Lucian and your father." He straightened, signaling to the men outside. "Watch her. Don't bruise the face. I want her intact when he gets here." When the door shut, Clara's breath came in shallow bursts. Fear pulsed through her veins, but beneath it burned something else. A cold, focused fury. She scanned the dimly lit room. Rusted beams, frayed ropes, a single barred window. Every sound outside, the wind, the water, the faint hum of the city, brought back that night at the cafe. Only now she wasn't just a bystander. She was the target. And somewhere out there, Adrian would already know. The serpent he thought he had killed was still alive, coiled deep within his own garden, and it had just sunk its fangs into the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. Outside the warehouse, the Thames churned beneath the storm, the river as black as ink under flashes of lightning. Inside, Clara sat bound to the chair, her wrists bleeding from the ropes. The flickering bulb above cast ghostly shadows on the rusted walls. Harlow lounged in the corner, calm as ever, his fingers drumming idly on the detonator that could turn the place into a grave. Then came the sound, tires grinding over wet gravel. A gust of wind burst through the cracks in the door. Harlow smiled faintly. "He's here." The door swung open. Adrian stepped inside, soaked to the bone, his eyes hard as steel. He carried no weapon, no backup, only a single-minded purpose. Harlow rose, adjusting his cufflinks. "You never disappoint, Adrian, just like your father. Reckless, sentimental." Adrian's voice was low, cutting through the storm. "Let her go." Harlow lifted the detonator, his thumb hovering over the red button. "Drop the gun or you both die here." "I didn't bring one," Adrian said coldly. "And you should know by now that I never walk into a fight without already deciding how it ends." Harlow's eyes narrowed. From above, a faint metallic sound echoed. Then a gunshot cracked like thunder. One of Harlow's guards dropped instantly, blood splattering against the concrete. Elias emerged from the steel beams, his rifle steady. Harlow spun around, startled, but it was too late. Adrian lunged forward, his hand clamping around Harlow's wrist, twisting until bones snapped. The detonator clattered to the floor, rolling out of reach. "You've played your games long enough," Adrian hissed, slamming Harlow against the wall. Harlow coughed, spitting blood, but he still sneered. "I made you, Adrian. Without me, you'd be nothing. Just another coward trying to wash away your father's sins." Adrien's grip tightened. His voice was almost a whisper, deadly and calm. "My father's mistake was forgiveness." He drew a gun from Harlow's own holster, pressing it against his chest. "I don't make the same one." The shot echoed once. Harlow collapsed, his eyes wide, disbelief frozen on his face. The smell of smoke mingled with the damp air. Adrian stood still for a long moment before turning toward Clara. She was shaking, tears streaming down her face. When he untied her, she didn't pull away. "You came," she whispered. "I promised," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I keep my promises." Elias approached quietly. "We need to go. His men won't be far behind." Adrian nodded, pulling Clara to her feet. She stumbled, and he caught her steady and sure. Together they stepped out into the storm. Sirens wailed in the distance, their blue lights flickering faintly through the mist. The warehouse stood silent behind them, a dying beast finally silenced. At rest, Clara turned once more to glance back. The place where everything had started was now nothing but ruins. The rain washed the blood from the steps, carrying it away into the river that never forgot. Adrian took her hand, his grip firm yet gentle. There was no triumph in his eyes, only exhaustion and something softer hidden beneath it. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. He met her gaze. "Now we live," he said. "For the ones who never got to." The rain fell harder, blurring the lines between past and present, guilt and grace. As dawn broke over the Thames, they stood side by side, survivors of a war neither had chosen, but both had ended. And in that fragile stillness after the storm, Clara realized that sometimes salvation doesn't come from justice or vengeance, but from two broken hearts choosing against all odds to keep beating. Dawn crept slowly over London, reluctant and gray, the river still wrapped in mist. Inside St. George's Hospital, the corridors were hushed, the sterile scent of antiseptic hanging heavy in the air. In the last room on the floor, Clara stirred awake. Her wrists ached beneath the bandages, but she was alive. Adrian sat beside her, half slumped in the chair, his shirt torn, his arm bound in gauze. His eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. Yet when she looked at him, they softened immediately. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "I'm not leaving," he said simply. "Not while you're still in that bed." She let out a tired laugh. "The police will find you. Harlow's dead. The city's already buzzing with theories about the explosion by the river. They'll trace it back to you." "I know," he replied quietly, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. "But it's over now. My father, Harlow, all of it. If they come for me, I'll answer. I just needed to make sure you're safe." Her throat tightened. The image of him from the night before, the flash of the gun, the look in his eyes, played over and over in her mind. There was no triumph in that moment, only sorrow. "Did it make you feel lighter?" she asked softly. "Ending it?" He hesitated. "No, just empty." She looked down at her hands. "I thought I'd hate you forever, but I can't." Silence settled between them, gentle and heavy. Outside, the rain tapped faintly against the glass. Then Adrian rose and crossed to the window, his voice calm but distant. "You can start over, Clara. Leave this city behind. There's a lawyer. He has the papers. A new apartment in Florence. Funding for your music. You once said you wanted to compose in Italy." She blinked, stunned. "You're trying to make amends." He turned, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "No, I'm trying to give you back what my family stole from yours. A future." "And you?" she asked. "What about you?" He paused. "Maybe Paris, maybe nowhere. I've never belonged anywhere, but I know I can't stay here. Not near you." Something in her chest cracked open. She wanted to stop him, to say the words she'd been afraid of for weeks, but they stuck in her throat. "If there's another life," he said, his voice low and unsteady, "I'll find you sooner, somewhere without shadows, without blood, just your music." Her tears spilled over. "And you?" "I'll just listen." The door creaked open. Elias appeared, his expression tight. "The police are downstairs. We have minutes, maybe less." Adrian nodded, then leaned down, his lips brushing her forehead. "Soft, fleeting, final. Live, Clara. Don't waste this life because of mine." Then he turned and walked out. He didn't look back. When the door closed, the silence that followed was unbearable. The rain had stopped. Sunlight began to filter through the clouds, glinting off the chair where he had sat. A small puddle left by his rain-soaked coat was still shining faintly. Elias lingered just long enough to hand her a sealed envelope. "He asked me to give you this," he said quietly. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, his handwriting firm and steady. "We are not born to carry our father's sins. Live for them and for us who chose to save each other, even when it was too late." Clara held the letter to her chest, her eyes closing as the first sunlight broke fully through. Outside, the Thames shimmered in gold. The storm had passed, and for the first time in a long time, she could breathe again. The past had ended by fire and rain. But what remained, fragile, imperfect, real, was the beginning of something new. And somewhere beyond the horizon of her grief, she could still hear him. Adrienne's voice, soft as a memory, fading into the rhythm of her heart. Spring passed quietly. Since that stormy night by the Thames, the city had begun to forget. Adrienne Morrow had vanished from the headlines. Clara had left London behind, trying to rebuild her life. But stories like theirs never truly end. They only wait for the last truth to surface. 6 months later, under a gray, brightening sky, Adrian stood before a small seaside cottage. The wind smelled of salt and distance. He looked older now, worn, yet his eyes still held the same quiet fire. In his hands was a worn leather folder, the last pieces of a decades-old lie. The door opened. An elderly man appeared, his shoulders slightly bent, his eyes sharp despite the years. "Edward Bennett?" Adrian asked. The man froze. "Who's asking?" "My name is Adrian Morrow," he said softly. "Lucian Morrow's son." Edward's breath caught. He nearly slammed the door, but Adrienne's voice stopped him. "Please hear me out. I'm not here for forgiveness. I'm here to return what was stolen." The name Lucian Morrow seemed to awaken ghosts. Edward trembled, gripping the doorframe. "Your family took everything from me. My name, my work, my wife." Adrian nodded. "I know. And I know my father believed a lie." He opened the folder, spreading out the papers. Harlow's falsified accounts, letters, bank transfers, hidden correspondences. "This proves you were framed, your records have been cleared. Your company shares are restored. The world will know the truth." Edward stared at the documents, then at him. Tears welled in eyes dulled by years of exile. "For 30 years, I lived like a ghost," he whispered. "And now you come to tell me it was all for nothing." Adrian bowed his head. "I'm here because it should have been me bearing the weight of that truth, not you." At that moment, a familiar voice spoke from behind. "Father." Edward turned. Clara stood in the doorway, her hair whipping in the sea wind. The world seemed to stop for a heartbeat. Neither moved. Then he stepped forward, trembling, and touched her face. "Clara, my little girl." She broke down, throwing her arms around him. The years of pain and silence dissolved in that single embrace. Outside, the waves crashed against the cliffs, as if echoing the release of everything they'd both carried for too long. Adrian watched from a few steps away, his expression unreadable. He should have felt relief, but what he felt was quieter, something like peace, mixed with the ache of knowing he no longer belonged in this picture. When Clara finally looked up, she found him standing by the edge of the garden, facing the sea. "How long have you known?" she asked. 3 months, he replied. "I needed to be sure before I told you." He deserved to meet you with the truth, not with hope. She studied him. The unshaven jaw, the weary eyes, the faint scar still visible under his sleeve. "You've done everything for me," she said softly. "But why do you still keep your distance?" He smiled faintly, his eyes on the horizon. "Because every time I see you, I remember my father's sins. Some ghosts don't disappear, Clara. They just learn to live in silence." She stepped closer, the wind catching her hair. "And after this I'll go back to France," he said. "And what's left?" The sea roared below them, wild and eternal. "If I ever finish my last composition," she said, "I'll send it to you." He turned, meeting her gaze one last time. "And I'll listen wherever I am." A moment later he was gone, his figure fading into the gray mist, leaving only the sound of the wind and the sea. Clara watched until the horizon swallowed him whole, tears mingling with the salt air. A month later, in a sunlit apartment in Florence, Clara sat at her piano. The sheet before her bore a single title written in blue ink, "The Last Rain in London." Each note carried a memory. His voice, his promise, the storm that began and ended everything. The melody rose and fell like the tide, tender and mournful, until the final chord lingered, trembling, before fading into silence. She closed her eyes. "Adrian," she whispered, "you said you'd listen." And somewhere in that quiet afternoon light, she could almost hear him, faint as wind, steady as a heartbeat, answering from beyond the distance. "I'm listening, Clara. I always have been." Winter returned to London with rain. Fine silver drops fell over the glass dome of the Royal Albert Hall, glistening like memories. Inside, the audience settled, the murmur of anticipation echoing beneath the vaulted ceiling. Somewhere among hundreds of seats, one man sat alone in the shadows, Adrian Morrow. He had aged, though not by years alone. The lines around his eyes spoke of silence, exile, and choices paid in blood. He wore black, simple and unremarkable, yet every inch of him carried a gravity that could not be hidden. He did not come to be seen. He came to listen. The lights dimmed. Clara appeared on stage, dressed in pale silk, her hair gathered softly, her eyes calm and radiant beneath the glow. She bowed once, then took her seat at the grand piano. The first chords drifted into the vast hall, fragile, trembling, then swelling into something vast and uncontainable. The melody carried the scent of rain, of grief, of the night she had written it alone in Florence. Every note seemed to bleed and heal at once. Adrian closed his eyes. He saw flashes of everything they had been. Gunfire, rain, the river, her trembling voice in the dark. He had believed their love a mistake born from guilt and fire. But as the music rose, he understood some mistakes are worth keeping. The climax came, a single note ringing clear as a wound, luminous against the storm of sound. Then silence. For a long, suspended moment, no one breathed. And when applause erupted, Clara stood, bowed, and lifted her gaze. She found him immediately. The distance between them vanished in that look. No words, no explanations, just two souls recognizing one another after surviving the same storm. Later, when the hall had emptied and the echoes faded, Clara stepped out into the backstage corridor. Rain had begun again, soft and steady. She found him waiting by the marble railing, smoke curling from a forgotten cigarette. "You came," she said softly. "I couldn't stay away," he replied. "I needed to hear how you see the world now." "And what did you hear?" He turned to her, his eyes reflecting the dim light. "I heard light in the place I only ever saw war." She smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips. "Then let's write a new piece together." He stepped closer, their breath mingling with the mist. "Are you sure my world isn't made for this kind of beauty?" "Then let me be the one who finds it," she whispered. Their lips met, not in haste or hunger, but in quiet certainty. The kiss was soft, like the closing of a book that had taken too long to write. When they parted, his eyes held peace at last. "If this is the next chapter," he said, his voice unsteady, "then I want it to begin with your music. "An end," she whispered. "With your silence, because even in silence, I can still hear you." They walked out together. The rain fell harder now, silvering the cobblestones, reflecting the city lights into trembling rivers. Clara took his hand and he let her. For the first time, neither led the other. They simply walked. Behind them, faint through the glass of the great hall, came the sound of distant strings, an unfinished symphony still waiting to be written. And under the rain, amidst the heart of London, the man who had once ruled the darkness, and the woman who had learned to see light within it, walked side by side, carrying between them the one thing both had searched for through pain and fire. A beginning, the music of forgiveness, the final note, unwritten but already heard.